Hey there, come a little closer to the fire with me. Just close enough to feel the smallest lift of warmth on your cheeks. And no closer than that. Tonight, I want to tell you a darker truth that medieval Europe kept behind velvet curtains and candle smoke. A truth that looked beautiful from across a great hall, then turned strange when you leaned in. A noblewoman whitening her face until it shone like moonlit stone. A physician quietly drawing blood so her skin could seem thinner than silk. If that pulls at your curiosity, I would love it if you'd like the video and subscribe. Only if it genuinely feels like the kind of quiet story you want to fall asleep inside. And if you feel like it, leave a comment telling me where you're listening from tonight. A bed with heavy blankets, a couch, a late walk with your collar turned up. I always picture it, and it makes this room feel less empty. Now, let the room dim in your mind. Let the flames do what flames do, and let your breathing follow their slow, unhurried rhythm. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Let your jaw loosen as if it has been holding a secret all day. Let your shoulders slide down, one small fraction at a time, until the bones remember they are allowed to rest. If you were standing here with me, you'd hear the fire speak in tiny clicks. You'd smell old wood and a faint sweetness of wax on the mantle. A candle burns down with the patience of a century. Dust sits on the edges of books like soft snow. And somewhere beyond the walls of this imagined room, a much older world waits. A world of stone corridors, drafty halls, and beauty that carried a price no one wanted to say aloud. So, gently, let's step back. Picture a castle in the middle of winter. The year somewhere around 1350. Not an exact year, because time in these stories is always a little foggy, like breath on cold air, but close enough that you can feel it. The stones are chilled, the tapestries are thick, yet the corners of rooms still hold a thin ribbon of cold. The corridors smell of damp wool and smoke that never quite leaves. Outside the walls, a river moves under a skin of ice, breathing slow. If you lean close to it, you'd hear the faint, patient shifting of water beneath, deep time in liquid form. Inside, people try to hold their own kind of time still, with rules and rituals and appearances that must not change. You are walking toward the great hall. Your shoes, or perhaps your boots, make a small sound against the floor. A soft tap, then a softer scrape, because there is always grit, always sand, always dust dragged in from the yard. A servant passes you carrying a tray, and the metal on it trembles with a faint, nervous rattle. Somewhere ahead, music moves like water behind a door. A low, steady hum of voices rises and falls, as if the room is breathing. As you get closer, the smell changes. Meat, spiced and roasting, warm bread, beeswax, wet cloaks drying near the fire, and something delicate too, perfume clinging to fabric, as if it has soaked into every thread. When the doors open, the hall receives you with heat and light, candlelight, hundreds of small flames trembling in iron chandeliers, firelight from a hearth large enough to swallow a whole log without effort, and faces, so many faces. At first, it is beautiful. Then, it becomes uncanny. Every noblewoman seems touched by the same winter. Their skin is pale beyond ordinary paleness, the kind of pale that makes you think of marble statues and lilies kept out of the sun. Their cheeks are not the warm color of life, but the faint hush of chalk. Their foreheads, their chins, their necks, all of it seems to glow, as if the candlelight is reflecting off fresh snow. And you know that feeling when something is almost too perfect, when your mind tries to explain it away, because the alternative would mean there is a choice behind it. I've always found it strange that we can accept a room full of ghosts as long as they are dressed well enough. In medieval Europe, pale skin wasn't only a preference, it was a message. It told everyone, without anyone needing to speak, that you did not work beneath the sun. You were not bent over fields. You were not browned by harvests, not freckled by long days. Your body had been sheltered, protected, kept indoors like a precious object. And that shelter, that privilege, was the point. A pale face was a banner, a sign that your hands did not carry the same stains as common labor. It was status written on the skin, and it came wrapped in ideas about purity, about refinement, about what was considered noble and what was considered ordinary. There are writings from the late medieval period, sometimes attributed in different ways depending on who is translating them, that speak about women's virtue as if it could be measured by how bright their skin appeared. Some scholars point to works. In art, holy figures were often painted with skin like snow. Saints, the Virgin Mary, women, meant to represent purity, all pale, all luminous. Over time, a quiet association formed in the mind. Pale meant holy. Pale meant clean. Pale meant protected from sin and from the coarse world outside. But what the candles could not show from a distance was the work required to keep that paleness, the daily, patient work, the stubbornness, the little rituals that began before dawn, while the hall still slept and the stones were colder than a basin of water. Imagine one of these women in her chamber. A heavy curtain holds back the morning light. A servant moves softly, careful not to wake the household. The woman sits at a table with a cloth spread over it, and on the cloth are small bowls and spoons, a brush, perhaps a little knife used for scraping powders. The air smells faintly sharp, like vinegar, and something else beneath it, something metallic that you can't quite name. Her hair is pinned up, not for beauty yet, just for practicality. A shawl slips from one shoulder. She pulls it back with a small, impatient motion, the way anyone does when fabric won't behave. It's almost comforting, that little human irritation, because it reminds you she isn't a statue at all. She's warm. She's breathing. She has a pulse. The servant crushes a white substance, slowly, with a small pestle. The sound is gentle, like snow being pressed. A thin liquid is added, drop by drop. The mixture turns into a paste, smooth and thick, the color of bone. It is meant to sit on the face and make it look like porcelain. Some people called it ceruse. Some called it simply the white. Recipes varied from place to place, and not every household used the same ingredients, but many of them shared a common heart: lead, worked into a form that could be spread on skin. In some manuscripts, people describe mixing white lead with vinegar, sometimes thickened or softened by other powders, as if chemistry were simply another sort of kitchen craft. I want to say this softly, because the story is meant for sleep, not for panic, but it matters. Lead does not belong inside a body. It doesn't belong in blood. It doesn't belong in breath. Yet here it was, welcomed in, invited, pressed into pores with careful fingers. The paste goes on cool at first. It feels like a mask. It covers freckles, shadows, any hint that the woman is made of living flesh. It smooths the face until it becomes a surface, a canvas for candlelight. Over it, sometimes a touch of powder to set it, so it will not shine too much. Sometimes a little scent to cover whatever the paste carries with it. Rose water, lavender, something resinous, like pine. Then she looks into her mirror. Not glass, not the clear, honest glass we might imagine, a sheet of metal, polished until it can pretend to reflect. In the dim light, it catches the curve of her cheekbone, the pale oval of her forehead, the dark of her eyes, but it warps, it blurs, it turns a face into an impression of a face, like a memory trying to stay awake. She tilts her head. The candle flame wobbles in the reflection. She watches the way light slides across the paste. She is not only seeing herself, she is checking a signal. Am I safe? Am I accepted? Will they look at me and think I belong? And still, she nods, because the mirror tells her enough. Enough to know she has achieved the right kind of pale. By the time she steps into the hall, she is part of the winter bouquet. Around her, other women are the same, each one a pale flower grown in the absence of sun. If you listen closely, you can hear small things, the whisper of sleeves, the brush of skirts, the soft click of jewelry against bone. You can hear laughter too, light as bubbles, but beneath it, there is always the faint rustle of competition. Who is the palest? Who looks the most delicate? Who can carry the look of fragility like a crown? Some of them avoid sunlight, as if it were a rumor of danger. They sit in shaded gardens. They wear veils that soften the world. They choose seats near tapestries instead of windows. They keep to halls and chambers. In a way, it is almost tender, this desire to stay untouched. In another way, it is deeply sad, because the human body was not built to be displayed like a relic. And this is where the darkness of the story begins to settle like soot, because the pale face is not only paint, it is a slow exchange. Day after day, the paste sits against warm skin. Night after night, it is wiped away, and the skin beneath is sometimes irritated, sometimes raw, sometimes strangely numb. Then in the morning, it returns, again, again, again. Some women believe the discomfort is normal. Some think it is the price of refinement. Some might even take pride in it, because suffering, when shared by a social class, can become a strange kind of proof. There is a quiet pride in enduring what others could not afford, even if what you are enduring is, in truth, something you should never have had to endure at all. And perhaps, quietly, you can already feel where this is going. Lead is patient. It does not shout. It moves in silence, like a tide in a riverbed. It can seep into the body slowly, and the body might not understand what is happening, only that something feels wrong. A stomach that tightens, a fatigue that lingers, hands that tremble slightly when they try to hold a cup, a mood that turns sharp around the edges, as if the mind is being pulled by invisible threads. Of course, they did not have our words for these things. They had their own names, their own explanations, their own physicians doing their best within the knowledge of their time. Some blamed humors, some blamed the air, some blamed the spirit, some simply believed that delicate women were meant to suffer the way candles are meant to burn down. And still, the whitening continued. Let's make the scene a little more specific. The way you can bring a dream into focus by noticing one small object. The feast is said to be at the court of Edward III in England, a place of banners and long tables and stories that travel faster than messengers. You can imagine the king's hall as a wide, smoky river of sound, lined with pillars and painted shields. The floor is strewn with rushes that hold yesterday's crumbs and today's perfume. Every step stirs up a faint scent of crushed herbs, damp straw, and old ash. A minstrel's fingers move over strings. A goblet is lifted. Someone laughs, then covers their mouth, because even laughter has rules here. and all around, the pale faces float through candlelight like lanterns. If you stand very still, you might notice the tiniest blue beneath the skin at a wrist, a temple, a throat, veins, proof of thinness, proof of softness, proof, in their eyes, that they are made of something delicate. I've always found it strange that a body's most human details can be turned into a badge, the very signs that we are alive, that blood moves and warms us, become something to display like jewelry. Writers of the time, including Christine de Pizan, in her work, often translated as the Book of the City of Ladies, spoke about women's virtue and worth in a world that judged them harshly. People quote her in different ways, and it's debated how much any single line should be pressed into service as evidence. But the broader atmosphere is clear. Whiteness, delicacy, distance from labor. These things were treated as markers of class and of moral value, not because the skin truly held virtue, but because the signal became the goal. And when a signal becomes the goal, the body is the thing that pays. Tonight, we'll stay with the beginning of that ritual, with the first layer of pale paint under candlelight, with the quiet logic of status and the soft cruelty of fashion. Let it feel distant, like a story heard through a thick wall. Because in a moment, as the fire settles and the hall grows quieter in our imagination, we will lean closer to the details they did not say out loud. The cramps that came like storms, the blood they offered up for translucence, and the strange little act of painting veins onto skin, as if to prove they were made of something finer than ordinary life. The fire in our room has shifted a little. One log sighs as it settles, and a thin ribbon of smoke curls upward before it disappears into the dark. If you listen for long enough, you start to notice how many sounds are actually soft. A candle's wick, the tiny crackle of resin, the faint brush of your own breath. Even silence has texture, if you let it. Hold on to that softness as we return to the castle, because the details we're about to touch are heavy, but we can carry them gently. In those chambers where noble women prepared for the day, the whitening paste was not a single recipe carved into stone. It was more like a family secret, passed hand to hand, altered by geography, by taste, by whatever an apothecary could supply. Some mixtures were plain enough, a white substance, vinegar, patience. Others became elaborate, almost ceremonial. A servant might grind crushed pearls into powder so fine it looked like milk fog. Eggshells, dried and pulverized, could be stirred in for a smoother finish. Some households added a hint of starch. Some whispered about a pinch of something sharper, something that promised an extra glow. And when people whisper about beauty, they often whisper about danger too. We can't be sure what every woman used, and scholars debate how widespread certain additions were. But the theme repeats across many accounts. Quote, "The paste went on thick, thick enough that candlelight bounced off it the way it bounces off stone." From across a room, a lady might look carved, untouched by weather, untouched by sweat. Close up, you might see the fine cracks where it dried, the faint texture, like dried river mud. You might catch a different scent beneath the perfume, something sour, something mineral. There were tricks for keeping it in place. A woman might avoid laughing too hard, because laughter creases the mask. She might drink carefully, because wine can stain. She might touch her cheeks only with the lightest fingertip, because too much pressure leaves a mark. Sometimes, servants carried small cloths and powders so they could repair the surface in private corners, like mending a tear in silk. If you were watching her closely, you'd see how much time this takes. The servant warms the paste slightly so it spreads more smoothly. The woman closes her eyes. The brush glides over her brow, then pauses, then continues, because the skin is never perfectly even. A little more on the nose, a little less near the eyes, where it might crack. A soft tap of powder, a wait for it to dry, another soft tap. Then the careful cleaning of the hands, because white paste under fingernails is a giveaway. The slow fastening of jewelry, so it does not smudge the neck. The choice of a veil, thin as spider silk, that keeps the face in shadow while still letting people see its brightness. Hours can disappear this way, not in grand events, but in tiny corrections. And the strangest part is how ordinary it can feel once you do it every day. And the body, being honest, would respond in its own quiet language. At first, it could be small. A headache that arrived like a slow cloud. A stomach that tightened after meals. A strange taste in the mouth, metallic and persistent, that no sweet wine could fully chase away. A mood that grew brittle, as if the mind had less room for patience. Some women might feel their limbs heavy, like sleeves soaked in rain. Others might notice their hands stumbling when they tried to sew, or when they lifted a mirror. Medieval physicians used the words they had. They spoke of colic, of cramps, of weakness. Some described a suffering that seemed to grip the belly like a fist and then fade, only to return again. They didn't always connect it to cosmetics, because so many things in their world could harm them. Smoke, damp, spoiled food, bad water, winter itself. Yet the pattern was there, repeating in the bodies of women who worked hardest to look like they were never touched by labor. And still, the routine continued, because the hall demanded it. Honestly, this is the part that makes my mind go quiet. The way a whole society can agree to treat slow poisoning as normal, if it comes in a beautiful package. I want you to imagine a girl in a noble household, not yet fully grown. Some accounts suggest girls began whitening early, sometimes around the age when childhood starts to thin and expectations move in. 12, perhaps. Younger in some places, older in others. She sits on a stool while her mother's servant prepares the mixture, and she watches with a kind of fascinated dread. She learns the rhythm before she even understands the risk. Sit still, don't squint, don't touch your face, don't step into sun. The practice becomes a coming-of-age ritual, without anyone naming it as such. Then, later, she becomes a woman named only by her title in the records. Duchess, Countess, Queen. The names shift depending on who is telling the story, and history is not always tidy. There are accounts of royal women praised for their luminous pallor and troubled by mysterious illness. Modern readers sometimes look back and wonder if lead played a role, because the symptoms fit too neatly. We can't always prove it with certainty, but the possibility hangs there, like a shadow behind a curtain. What we can say, softly and truthfully, is that many women were surrounded by substances that could harm them, and they used them daily. And then, when pale paint no longer felt enough, some chose methods that moved from the surface into the body's deeper rhythms. Bloodletting. You might have heard of it as a medical practice, a way physicians believed they could balance the humors. It was common. It was respectable. It was, in its own way, logical within medieval thinking. But there are accounts suggesting that beauty borrowed this practice too, turning it into a kind of aesthetic tool. Imagine the quiet preparation, a basin placed on a table, linen folded and refolded, a small blade cleaned carefully, the room warmed by a brazier, because cold makes the body tighten, and tight veins do not give easily. The woman sits, sleeve loosened. She watches the candle flame in the corner of her eye, because watching anything else might make her tense. The physician, or perhaps a trained barber, takes her arm and presses gently, as if he is holding a bird. He ties a strip of cloth above the elbow. The skin below swells slightly, a vein rising. The gesture is practiced, almost tender, and when the cut is made, it is not a dramatic thing. It is a small opening, a controlled release, a few ounces, some accounts say, a measured amount, not because pain was the goal, but because translucence was. When the bandage is tied and the linen is pressed to the skin, the woman might feel light, a little hollow, as if her thoughts are drifting a step away from her body. Some might describe it as purity. Some might describe it as weakness. In the hall, later, the candlelight catches the face and makes it look thinner, and the eyes shine a little more because the body is tired, and everyone nods because the look is correct. There is an irony here that always makes me pause. You know that feeling when you work so hard to prove you are safe, and the work itself becomes the danger? Medieval noble women tried to look untouched by hardship, and they achieved it by inviting hardship into their blood. The performance did not stop there. In some courts, the illusion of translucence became almost theatrical. Women painted veins onto their skin, thin blue lines at the temples, across the wrists, sometimes along the inner arms where the flesh is pale. A bit of pigment mixed into egg white, smoothed carefully with the tip of a brush, then softened with a finger so it looked like it was part of the body, not laid on top of it. If you were watching closely, you would see how steady a hand must be to make a vein look real, how slow the breath becomes, how the woman holds still, as if movement would break the spell. She might dab, lift, dab, again. She might lean toward the window for a moment, only to pull back from the daylight as if it could bruise her. And then, after all that, she returns to her mirror. Again, not a clear glass mirror, but polished metal, catching light like a pond catching the moon. It would blur edges, it would distort, it could make a face look both closer and farther away than it truly was, which means something quietly heartbreaking. Some women were chasing a beauty standard they could not fully see. They relied on others, a servant's praise, a friend's glance, a rival's silence, the way a man's eyes lingered for a heartbeat longer at a feast, the way a priest's sermon praised purity in the same breath. It warned against vanity, leaving everyone to decide what purity looked like. The church, as always, stood in more than one place at once. Some voices condemned adornment, calling it distraction, calling it temptation. Other images, painted on panels and set above altars, showed holy women with skin like snow, as if pallor itself were a kind of virtue. The message became tangled. Be modest, but be pure. Avoid vanity, but resemble sanctity. And the easiest way to resemble sanctity in a candlelit world was to glow. So the powders remained on dressing tables. The bowls stayed ready. The recipes were copied, improved, guarded. Whole little industries grew around them. Servants learned to mix and apply. Apothecaries learned which powders sold fastest. And somewhere beneath all that commerce and ritual, bodies quietly tried to endure. Sometimes, the normalization was so complete that beauty supplies were treated like property worth inheriting. There are wills that mention face paints and whitening powders passed down to daughters, as if the tools of a dangerous ideal were as ordinary as linen or silverware. A mother's pale mask becomes a daughter's starting point, a deadly heirloom, handed over with love. There's a moment I like to linger on, because it says so much without needing to shout. A mother, old enough to know that her mornings have become A kind of quiet battle writes her will. She divides silver and cloth, a ring, a cup, perhaps a prayer book. And then, in that same careful handwriting, she leaves her face paints and whitening powders to her daughter, not as a warning, not as a confession, as a gift. Some wills from the late medieval period do mention beauty supplies like this, and one well-known example is a will attributed to Margaret of Anjou in the 1480s, passing cosmetics along as if they were simply part of a lady's proper inheritance. The exact lists and translations vary, and historians debate details, but the feeling remains. The danger was so normalized, it could be wrapped in tenderness and handed down, and you can almost feel the daughter's hands opening the box later. The little jars, the folded cloth, the faint smell of vinegar trapped in wood. She inhales it and thinks of her mother, and because she loves her mother, she tries to look like her. That's how it travels, not only through fashion, but through love. In our modern world, we chase a healthy glow, sunlight in a bottle, warmth on the cheek. They chase the opposite. They chase the beautiful hush of a corpse, because it said, "I do not labor, I do not sweat, I do not belong to the fields." It's easy to judge them from the outside, but if you sit with it long enough, you start to see the human shape underneath, the desire to belong, the fear of being cast out, the quiet rivalry that turns into a cage. Let that thought be gentle as it settles. It doesn't need to sting. It can simply be a small truth resting in your palm. It is quiet, the way culture repeats itself. It doesn't feel like a decision. It feels like a room you grow up inside, and only later realize there was ever a door. Tonight, as you listen, I don't want you to feel trapped by that room. I want you to feel the distance, the deep time between then and now, like the space between two candle flames. You can observe it without being burned, and still, we keep walking through it, slowly, because this story has more chambers. In the next stretch, the obsession slides upward from skin to hairline. Because if the face must look sheltered from the sun, then the forehead must look broad enough to suggest a mind untouched by toil. And that is where the tweezers come out, where hours vanish in small pinches, where the quiet pain of plucking becomes its own kind of status, and where beauty, once again, asks for something living to be removed. The hall fades behind us the way a candle flame fades when you turn your head, and we drift into a quieter corridor where the noise becomes a muffled river. I like this part of the walk, the in-between spaces, the places where footsteps sound softer, where a tapestry breathes when a draft slides under it, where you can hear your own pulse and pretend it belongs to the building. If you were here with me, we would pause beside a narrow window slit. Outside, the courtyard is a bowl of darkness. A guard's lantern swings, once, twice, then disappears behind stone. Inside, the air is warmer, scented with smoke and wool, and that faint, sharp edge of vinegar that seems to follow the pale faces wherever they go. And now the obsession climbs upward. It always does, doesn't it? When a culture decides the body is a message board, it is never satisfied with a single sign. It keeps searching for new surfaces, new symbols, new places to prove you belong. In the early centuries of this story, the ideal forehead was not yet the stage it would become, but by the time we reach the courts of the late 1300s and early 1400s, the forehead begins to matter in a peculiar, almost mathematical way. Not only must the skin be pale, it must be uninterrupted, wide, smooth, like a clean page. Some medieval writers of physiognomy claimed the forehead revealed the mind. A broad, High forehead suggested intelligence, noble breeding, refined temperament. It is debated how widely these texts were read by women themselves, but the idea seeped into the court like scent into fabric. If you can make your forehead look larger, you can make yourself look clever, or at least look like the kind of person everyone expects to be clever. And the easiest way to enlarge the forehead is to move the hairline back, not with scissors, not with a neat trim, with absence. Imagine a chamber again, smaller than the great hall, lit by a single candle on a table and a faint glow from a brazier in the corner. The window is covered, not only for warmth, but to keep daylight from touching the face. The woman sits on a stool, a cloth draped over her shoulders. Her hair is gathered back, exposing the line where hair meets skin, that soft border people rarely think about until a fashion tells them to. A servant stands behind her, patient, practiced. In some households, this servant was just an ordinary maid, trained to do many things. In others, there were specialists, women employed for the sole purpose of plucking hair. Some records suggest such roles existed, at least in certain noble circles. And even if the job title shifts with language and time, the function is clear. Someone had to do the work, day after day, without hesitation. The tools are simple: tweezers, sometimes silver, if the household wants everything to gleam. A small needle, a strip of linen, a bowl of water, maybe a paste, resinous and pale, meant to grip hair at the root. Some recipes mention lime or other caustic substances mixed into plucking pastes, and it is hard to know how often those were truly used. But the idea itself tells you something. People were willing to burn the boundary of the face, to redraw it. The woman closes her eyes. The first pluck is always the one that teaches you what the next hour will feel like. A tiny pinch, a sharp little sting, then a warm afterglow that spreads across the skin. It is not unbearable, not in the way of a sudden injury. It is a controlled discomfort, repeated until it becomes its own rhythm. Pluck, pause, pluck, a breath, pluck again. You know that feeling when you listen to rain, and at first, each drop is distinct. Then, after a while, it becomes a single sound, a blanket of noise. Pain can do that too. It can blur into a steady background, especially when you have decided it must be endured. The servant works slowly. She does not want to tear the skin. She wants the hairs to leave neatly, one by one. So the hairline retreats like a shoreline at low tide. The woman's fingers curl on her lap. She might recite a prayer in her head. She might focus on the candle flame, how it leans when a draft passes, how it straightens again. Anything to give the mind somewhere else to rest. Hours pass, not dramatic hours, quiet ones, the kind that feel like they barely happened, except for the tenderness blooming along the scalp. When it is done, the servant smooths the skin with a cool cloth. The woman's hair is lowered again, but the border has changed. A little more forehead is revealed. A little more of the face becomes the face. She checks her reflection in the metal mirror. The candle wobbles. The polished surface makes her look softer, more distant. She tilts her head, as if listening to her own image. Satisfied, she breathes out. And then, because fashion rarely stops at one edge, the plucking moves lower. Eyebrows. Sometimes they were thinned into delicate lines. Sometimes they were nearly erased. Some portraits from Northern Europe show women with brows so faint they seem like whispers. Scholars debate how much portrait style reflects real practice, but there are written complaints and medical notes that suggest eyebrow removal did happen, often as part of the same aesthetic, a smooth, open, pale upper face, like a dome of marble. The process is similar, but the skin is finer here. The sting is more immediate. The eyes water. The woman must hold still, because a flinch can turn a careful pluck into a scratch. The servant's hand hovers, then closes. Pluck, pluck. A tiny bead of blood appears once, then is dabbed away. It is treated like a nuisance, not a warning. The forehead is wiped gently. Powder is applied. A veil might be chosen that casts a flattering shadow where brows used to be, and the woman smiles at dinner, carefully, as if her face is a painting still drying. But bodies remember, when you remove hair repeatedly, the skin can swell. The follicles can become inflamed. Tiny infections can take root. Medieval physicians wrote about fevers and eruptions and sores in all sorts of contexts. Some later commentators describe chronic irritation from overplucking, even a kind of persistent heat in the brow, as if the head itself were irritated by the daily assault. We cannot always match their terms to our modern diagnoses, but the suffering can be felt through the words. Imagine the woman, later that night, alone for a moment. She lifts her hand to the edge of her hairline and stops. Because touching hurts, the skin feels tender, hot. She can't scratch, can't soothe, because any pressure might leave a mark. She sits still and lets the sensation burn quietly. In the corner, the candle shortens. Time shrinks. The room smells of smoke and the faint medicinal sharpness of ointment. Ointments existed. Herbal salves, honey, wine used as a cleanser, leaves crushed into paste. Sometimes these would help, sometimes not. Some treatments probably did more harm than good. It is a gentle reminder that medical care was a patchwork of observation and belief, and the body was asked to endure a lot in the name of both health and beauty. There is a detail that always makes me feel oddly sad. Even after hours of plucking, the result could never be fully stable. Hair grows back, stubble appears, the face tries to return to itself. So the routine repeats, morning after morning, day after day, and fashion shifts like wind. In one decade, the ideal forehead might be 2 finger widths. Then it grows to 3, then 4. In some accounts, by the mid-1400s, women were pulling the hairline so far back that it nearly reached the crown. It is difficult to quantify with precision, but the pattern is unmistakable. A competitive escalation. Each chord, each circle, pushing a little further. Because if the standard is a symbol of status, then the most extreme version becomes the loudest signal. If you were a young girl in that world, you might learn the rules the way you learn a language, not from a single lesson, but from glances and laughter and small humiliations, a whisper behind a sleeve, a friend's sympathetic look, a servant's quiet warning that someone has noticed your hairline looks too natural. And then, on some dawn, you sit on the stool and the tweezers begin. There are letters, sometimes attributed to women like Margaret of York, that speak of discomfort, of visible irritation, of headdresses that no longer sit comfortably because the skin beneath is raw. Details shift with translation, and historians argue about how to interpret these personal writings, but the human shape remains. A woman trying to maintain an ideal that hurts her because the alternative hurts her in a different way. Social shame can be a stronger blade than any tweezer, so the plucking continues, even when the skin protests. It becomes a private suffering that is oddly public. Everyone can see the result. Few people mention the process. It is like a rule of the hall. Admire the surface, ignore the cost. And the cost is not only physical, Let's slow down and sit with one morning in particular, because mornings were the true battlefield. The castle is barely awake. The stone is cold under bare feet. A single candle waits on the dressing table, its flame bent slightly by a draught that sneaks under the door. The servant is already there, because in a wealthy household, a lady's body becomes a shared project, maintained by many hands. A small box opens, tweezers wrapped in linen, a comb, a vial of rose water, a little pot of paste that smells faintly of resin, and something sharp. The woman sits and tucks her hands into her robe so no one can see them tremble. The servant pins the hair back and begins. Pluck, pause, pluck. After an hour, the skin warms. After 2, it throbs. The servant dabs cool water across the hairline, and the woman feels relief, spread like a thin sheet of rain. This is the darker logic that almost makes itself sound reasonable. If the routine hurts, you hide indoors. And if you hide indoors, you stay pale. And if you stay pale, you look noble. Pain supports status, and status explains pain. Then the eyebrows. Tweezers near the eye feel intimate, dangerous. The eye waters. A tear rolls down and is brushed away before it can smear the powder. The woman breathes slowly, counting the breaths the way you might count waves, telling herself she is becoming what she must become. When it is done, a salve is smoothed on. Herbs, fat, a faint sweetness. The sting dulls into heavy tenderness. She will not laugh too hard today. She will not frown. She will not touch her face. And somewhere in a household account book, someone has recorded the cost of all this. Wages, tools, ointments. Exact sums are hard to pin down, but it is clear the expense could rival months of a craft worker's pay. A whole chain of labor, just to move a hairline back by a finger's width. That thought lingers with me like smoke, clinging to a cloak. The castle does not care what your forehead looks like. It will outlive every fashion. Yet the people inside it spend their brief years rearranging themselves as if the rearrangement could protect them from time. The cost is psychological too. When a face becomes a project, the mind begins to live inside the mirror. Even when the mirror is blurred, even when it lies, it pulls attention like a tide. You find yourself thinking about angles, about borders, about how much forehead is enough, about whether your eyes look clever. You become your own sculptor, your own critic, your own quiet jailer. Honestly, I've always found it strange how a standard can make people forget the very thing it claims to measure. They pluck their hairlines to look intelligent, then spend hours each morning in pain and worry, unable to use that intelligence for anything but the maintenance of an image. But this is the pattern of the story. A standard appears. It spreads. It hardens. It becomes so normal that it no longer feels like a choice. And when it becomes normal, it starts to travel, not only across decades, but across borders. Because while Western European courts were lifting hairlines and erasing brows, other regions were cultivating a very different ideal, right at the center of the face. An ideal that asked for connection rather than absence. A single line, a bridge between two brows. In the next part of our journey, we'll drift eastward to candlelit rooms in Byzantine halls and Persian courts, where women sat with tiny brushes and dark powders, measuring the space between their eyebrows as carefully as a jeweler measures a gem. And we'll see how beauty can reverse itself completely while keeping the same dark heartbeat underneath. The fear of being seen as incomplete. We drift eastward the way smoke drifts, not in a straight line, but in slow curls, following warmth and quiet. Picture a different hall now, not the drafty stone of northern castles, but a chamber tiled in patterns that catch candlelight like water. The air carries the faint sweetness of incense, and somewhere beyond the door, there is the hush of a city that never fully sleeps. If you listen closely, you can hear it. A distant footstep on marble, a soft call, the tiny clink of metal as someone adjusts a lamp. Here, the face tells a different story. In some corners of medieval Europe, the ideal was to erase the brows, to create a smooth expanse. In parts of the Byzantine world and in Persian courts, another ideal gathered power, connection. The two brows were not meant to be strangers, they were meant to meet. A single dark line across the brow, sometimes thick and bold, sometimes delicate as thread, a monobrow, a unibrow, a bridge. Whatever name you give it, the meaning was larger than the hair itself. Some writers suggested it signaled intelligence. Others linked it to passion, fertility, or a kind of protective power, as if the face could hold a charm. It is debated how much of this was widely believed and how much was later explanation, but the social reality is easier to feel. If the fashionable women around you wear that line, the line becomes a gate, and you either pass through it or you stand outside. So the morning ritual shifts. Instead of tweezers pulling hair away, we find tiny brushes building hair where there is none. Imagine a young woman seated near a window, covered with thin fabric. The light is dim on purpose, soft enough to flatter, bright enough to work by. A silver tray rests on her lap. On it, a small mortar, a pestle, a pinch of dark powder, a dish of egg white or oil, and a little bundle of something that looks like coarse thread but is actually hair, goat hair in some recipes, or a fibrous substitute in others. The powder might be antimony, which was used historically in cosmetics across many regions, though exact formulations varied and are sometimes hard to reconstruct. In some places, it was mixed with soot, with ground minerals, with whatever could deepen the black. The egg white gives it body. The hair gives it texture. So the painted bridge does not look like a simple stain, but like something grown. The servant, or perhaps a specialized cosmetic artist, dips the brush and tests the mixture on a scrap of cloth. Then she turns to the face. The woman holds her breath, not because she fears pain this time, but because she fears error. A crooked line would be humiliating. A smudge would imply carelessness. The bridge must be measured as precisely as lace. A first stroke touches the skin between the brows. It is cool at first, then it begins to dry, tightening slightly like a thin mask. The woman's eyes blink slowly, careful not to wrinkle the skin. She keeps her jaw relaxed. The brush makes another stroke, another. The line darkens, thickens, becomes a presence. There is something oddly soothing about watching the line appear. It is like watching ink sink into paper, like watching a path form across snow. And yet, the calm sits on top of danger. Some of these pigments were not gentle. Antimony can irritate. Soot can scratch. Other additives, depending on supply and fashion, might carry heavy metals. Archaeological studies in various regions have found traces of lead and mercury in ways that suggest prolonged exposure to cosmetics, though connecting a specific practice to a specific burial is always complicated. Still, the idea lingers. Each morning, a woman paints close to her eyes, breathing powder, touching a tender patch of skin, and she does. The room smells faintly metallic, faintly smoky. The brush is wiped, then dipped again. The bridge is refined, not too thick, not too thin. The artist steps back, tilts her head, then leans in for one last correction, the way a painter adds a final shadow, to make a face seem alive. The woman finally exhales. She looks into her mirror. Here, too, mirrors can be imperfect, polished metal or tinted glass, and the reflection may lie kindly. Her brows meet. Her face looks complete, unified, almost sealed, and that sense of being sealed mattered. In some traditions, a connected brow was thought to ward off envy, to carry the evil eye, not as a curse, but as a shield. The line could be beauty and protection at once. You can almost feel the relief in that, the way superstition sometimes wraps itself around a trend to make it seem inevitable. There is also the simple truth of status. If antimony is imported, if the best powders come from distant trade routes, then the darkness of your brow is also the darkness of your purse. The line becomes an announcement. I have access. I have resources. I can spend time every morning perfecting this detail while someone else sweeps floors or carries water. You know that feeling when a tiny accessory suddenly seems to decide how you are treated? A ring, a brand name, a badge. Here, it is hair and pigment, but the psychology is familiar. And because the pressure is familiar, the escalation is familiar too. For women whose brows did not naturally meet, the daily painting could become an obsession. One stroke was never quite enough. The bridge had to be darker, more even, more convincing. Some accounts suggest that young girls practiced early, training the hand to paint a steady line, the way a scribe trains the wrist to write. 10 years old, 12, sitting by lamplight, drawing a bridge again and again, until the fingers could do it without shaking. When practice is required for acceptance, childhood stops feeling like childhood. There were professional artists in some courts, people whose job was to make the line perfect. They measured, they adjusted, they carried small kits with vials and brushes. They knew how long the mixture took to dry, how to stop it from cracking, how to hide a mistake by turning it into a shadow. If you think of it as artistry, it sounds almost gentle. If you remember the social stakes, it becomes darker. And then there is the other path, the path of permanence. Some women, afraid of smudging, afraid of rain, afraid of being caught unprepared, chose to make the bridge last. Tattooing is mentioned in some contexts, and while evidence is uneven and debated, the very idea is telling. A woman so afraid of one morning without the line that she would rather mark her skin forever. Imagine the quiet after such a choice. The skin between the brows tender, a faint swelling, the need to avoid touching it, the need to hide it while it heals, because the irony of a beauty wound is that it must be concealed until it becomes attractive again. The medical consequences, when they came, were not dramatic in a single moment. They were slow. Irritation that becomes inflammation, eyes that sting, lids that swell, vision that blurs for an afternoon, then for longer. Medieval physicians described fevers and humors and inflammations. Some spoke of chronic conditions around the brow, sometimes with names that sound poetic and sad, as if the body itself were melancholic. Whether those labels map cleanly onto modern medicine is uncertain, but the lived experience is easy to imagine. A daily soreness that becomes normal until you forget what it felt like not to be irritated. Let's linger in the workshop of the mixture, because that is where the romance of the trend disappears and the mechanics remain. The mortar is cool stone. When the pestle turns, the powder makes a faint, dry whisper, like sand rubbed between palms. A servant adds a drop of oil, then another, watching the texture change from dust to paste. If the paste is too wet, it will slide. If it is too dry, it will flake. So there is patience, And there is a kind of practiced tenderness, as if they are preparing ink for a sacred text. Sometimes, a small amount of hair is teased into the mixture. It clings in tiny strands. The brush must be cleaned often, or the line becomes clumpy. The woman watches, half fascinated, half uneasy, because she knows the bridge is supposed to look natural, and yet nothing about the preparation feels natural. It feels like construction. When the artist begins, she may use a thin stick first, making a faint guide mark, a ghost line. Then, the real pigment follows. The woman's breathing slows. She tries to keep her face still, because even a smile can distort the proportions. Even a thought can show on skin. In some households, this ritual had its own etiquette. No sudden laughter, no bright light, no children bursting in. It was treated like a serious craft. A wrong bridge could follow you for weeks in whispers, and the powders themselves were not always easy to get. Traders brought pigments along routes that smelled of dust and camel, leather and sea salt. A small pouch of the darkest mineral could cost more than a laborer earned in a month. That kind of expense turns a brow into a statement. It is why women might keep their pigment in a tiny box lined with cloth, as carefully guarded as jewelry. Mirrors, too, become part of the story. Some archaeological finds include small grooming sets with combs and applicators that seem designed for detail work. There are accounts of specialized mirrors, darker or tinted, meant to make the brow look richer, the line more dramatic. Even if those descriptions are sometimes exaggerated, you can imagine it easily. A mirror that does not show truth, but shows the version of you that the room rewards. Now, about the consequences. When pigment sits close to the eye, the body does not always forgive. The skin between the brows can become raw from scrubbing off yesterday's line. The pores clog, tiny bumps rise, the eyes sting from fumes and dust. A woman might wake with lids that feel heavy, as if sleep has glued them shut. She rinses them with water that smells of rose, and the relief lasts only a moment. Medical writers described inflammation and irritation around the eyes for many reasons, and it is difficult to separate beauty from illness in their notes. Some later interpretations speak of brow fever or chronic irritation blamed on cosmetics. Whether the name is exact or not, the experience is clear enough. A persistent soreness that becomes part of the day, like a low ache in the wrist of a scribe. And then there is the mind. Some women, unable to achieve the perfect bridge, carried a private despair that people of the time might have called melancholia. There are references to sadness and withdrawal tied to appearance. And even if we cannot diagnose across centuries, we can recognize the feeling, the way a small feature can grow enormous in your thoughts, the way a mirror can become a judge, the way a mistake can feel like a sentence. Imagine a woman at a social gathering, laughing softly while her mind keeps returning to her brow. Is the line fading? Is it smudging? Did she touch it when she adjusted her veil? Does the candlelight reveal a gap? She smiles. She nods. She holds her posture. But inside, she is counting minutes until she can retreat and repair herself. The saddest irony is that the line is supposed to signal unity, completeness, wholeness, yet the pursuit of it can split a person in two: the self who lives and the self who performs. That split is the same shadow we saw in the plucked hairlines. Different tools, same ache. By the time the evening ends, the woman returns to her chamber. The bridge has held. Mostly, she sits at the table again and begins the removal. A cloth dampened with oil, slow rubbing. The pigment resists. The skin warms. She rubs again. A faint Black smear stains the cloth like soot. She keeps rubbing because leaving residue might irritate the skin, might itch in the night, might stain the pillow. When the face is finally bare, it looks strangely vulnerable. Two separate brows, two separate arcs, and between them, plain skin. She looks at herself and feels, for a heartbeat, almost unfinished. Not because she is, but because she has been trained to believe it. Then she blows out the candle, and in the darkness, the face belongs to no fashion at all. And yet, she keeps painting. Because in the banquet hall, in the wedding feast, in the social visit, the line is noticed. It is praised. It is copied. A woman without it might be mocked or simply treated as unfinished. Regional variation made the pressure even more complicated. In one place, a thick, bold bridge might be admired. In another, a thin, delicate connection was the ideal, refined like calligraphy. Travelers wrote about recognizing origin and class by the style of the brow. Even if the travelers exaggerated, the idea feels true. A face becomes a map. The brow becomes a border crossing. At the center of all of it is the same quiet fear we have been following since the pale powders and the tweezers. The fear of being seen as wrong. Not ugly, exactly. Wrong, out of place, unfit for the room. So women measured their own faces against a standard and adjusted with whatever tools they could obtain. Powder, hair, egg white, oil, then powders and hair again, the way tides return. If you were standing here with me, I would point out the smallest thing, the sound of the brush on skin. It is soft, like a mouse moving in straw. It is the sound of a decision repeating itself. And as the line becomes normal, it begins to loosen its tie to any single meaning. It becomes fashion, pure and simple. The protective charm fades into the background. The intelligence myth becomes a convenient story. What remains is the daily ritual and the quiet ache of keeping up. The candle burns down. The woman rises. She turns her face toward the door, careful not to rub her brow. She moves into the world wearing her connection, her unity, her dark little bridge. And then, as always, fashion turns again. Because while some women were building a line across their brows, other courts were chasing an even more haunting ideal. An ideal that did not ask for a single feature, but for an entire body to look as if it were gently drifting away from life itself. Hollow cheeks, pale skin, shadowed eyes, a kind of holy thinness that made people whisper the word angel when what they really meant was absence. We will step into that next chamber soon, where fasting becomes a beauty tool, and faintness becomes praise, and the night air feels colder, as if even the candles hesitate. The next chamber is colder, even with the fire alive. It is strange how a room can feel cold when it is filled with people, but it happens when everyone is trying to look like they belong to the grave. Candlelight skims across cheeks that have been coaxed into hollows. Shadows have been invited to settle under the eyes. Mouths stay closed, as if speaking would spend too much of the little life they have left to display. If you were here with me, you would hear it first. Not screams, not drama, just the quiet sounds of restraint. The careful sip of watered wine, the gentle clink of a spoon set down untouched. A breath taken shallowly, as if air itself is indulgent. This is the era where beauty leans toward absence. A certain kind of high society between roughly the early 1400s and the beginning of the 1500s seemed to fall in love with a look that resembles illness or holiness, or both at once. The details change depending on who you read. Some scholars argue The timeline was uneven from court to court. Some say the descriptions are exaggerated, shaped by moral writers who love to criticize vanity. Still, enough fragments point in the same direction that we can feel the shape of it: a cultivated paleness, a practiced thinness, a delicate exhaustion, worn like velvet. It begins, often, with what the manuals and gossip might call an emptying. Not a single act, but a routine. A woman rises before dawn. Her chamber is quiet except for the faint shifting of fabric and the tired crackle of the fire settling into ash. A servant brings a basin of water that smells faintly of herbs. The woman washes her face, slowly, as if she is already a spirit preparing to appear. Then she does not eat. She may take a sip of wine thinned with water, perhaps scented with rose. She may take a wafer, a crumb. Sometimes the fasting is presented as piety, a devotion that will make the soul lighter. Sometimes it is presented as fashion, a way to carve the cheekbones, sharp enough to catch candlelight, like blade edges. The hunger comes in waves. At first, it is sharp. Then, it becomes a low hum in the body. Then, after days, it turns strangely quiet, as if the stomach itself has learned the rules and stopped asking. You know that feeling when you stay awake too long and your thoughts begin to float, slow and foggy, like they are moving through water. Starvation can do something similar. The world softens. Sounds become distant. The body feels both heavy and hollow, and the hush of that sensation becomes part of the aesthetic, because a woman who looks faint, who moves slowly, who speaks softly, is praised for being ethereal. A wobble is interpreted as delicacy. A collapse becomes a story told with admiration, not alarm. In some accounts, young women were praised for fainting at ceremonies, as if the body giving up for a moment proved the soul was refined. It is hard to read such descriptions without wanting to reach across time and offer a chair, a bowl of broth, a gentle refusal. But the court has its own logic. The court turns weakness into currency. Fasting alone is not enough, of course. The body is stubborn. It holds on to itself. So other practices join in. Bloodletting, for example, appears in many medieval medical contexts, sometimes for real illness, sometimes as a general balancing. Here, it becomes a beauty tool. A physician or a barber surgeon draws a small amount of blood to keep the complexion pale, to keep the lips less red, to keep the skin translucent. Imagine the scene. The room is warm with candle smoke. The woman sits with her sleeve rolled up. The physician's hands are clean by the standards of the time, rinsed with wine or vinegar. A band is tied around the arm. The skin rises slightly under pressure. The woman looks away, not because she cannot bear it, but because she wants to remain composed. A small cut, a dark bead, then a thin stream, collected in a cup marked perhaps with lines, measured carefully. 3 ounces, some accounts say, a number that feels both precise and surreal. When it is done, the cut is covered. The woman's face looks a shade lighter, or perhaps she imagines it does. And imagination is a powerful cosmetic. The body, though, keeps a ledger. Too little food, too much blood, too much strain. The legs tremble when climbing stairs. The ribs feel like they are made of paper. The heart beats strangely fast at night, then slow in the morning, as if it cannot decide how hard to work for a body that is asking to appear half gone. And then there are the powders. We have already walked through the pale foundations, made from lead and vinegar, from crushed shells and ground pearls. In this corpse bride era, those powders become even more important, because the face must look not merely pale, but drained, a blank canvas for shadows. The servant opens small pots. One contains a white paste, heavy and cool. Another contains a dark powder, charcoal-based, sometimes mixed with other substances, applied under the eyes to deepen hollows. A third contains something red, not for vitality, but for the illusion of fever. A tiny touch on the cheek, placed carefully, as if painting a saint who is suffering beautifully. I want you to picture the brushstrokes, slowly, a soft brush, perhaps made of animal hair, dipped into the white. The paste spreads across the face, smoothing texture, hiding the natural warmth of skin. It dries slightly, tightening. The woman keeps her expression calm so it does not crack. Then the shadow, a darker brush, tapping under the eyes. Not too much. The goal is not a bruise. The goal is the suggestion of depth, the hint that the body is too delicate for the world. Then the red, barely there, on the cheekbones. A fever spot, a glow that does not imply health, but implies holy effort, an inner flame burning while the outer body fades. All of this takes time, hours, sometimes, and the time itself becomes part of the status. If you can spend 3 hours constructing your face, you are not carrying water, you are not digging, you are not sweating in sunlight. You are proving you belong inside stone walls. But the face is only one surface. The body itself must appear lighter, smaller, less anchored, so the diet becomes thinner, watered wine, broth, perhaps, but only a little. Communion wafers. When the hunger becomes too loud, the woman may press a hand to her stomach and breathe until the sound in her own ears dulls it. And sometimes, if gossip is to be believed, the routine includes vomiting, encouraged by tools, silver spoons, small instruments designed to help the body empty itself. I cannot confirm how common that truly was, and it is wise to treat some of those more lurid details with caution. Yet, even the possibility tells us the direction of desire, toward emptiness, toward the body as a shell. There is another, darker twist in these stories. Illness itself becomes a costume. Some women, it is said, intentionally expose themselves to mild sickness, hoping for the right kind of wasting, the right kind of flush. Tuberculosis, consumption, the white fever, names that drift through history like ghosts. Whether people truly sought infection is debated, but we do know that illness was romanticized in certain eras, and in a world without modern medicine, sickness was everywhere. It did not need to be invited. It waited at the edge of every gathering like a quiet listener. The church's role is complicated, as always. Official teachings warned against vanity, but saints were praised for fasting. Mystics were admired for denying the body. A woman who grew thin through devotion could be honored. A woman who grew thin through fashion could borrow the language of devotion. The line between prayer and performance became thin as a thread. It is one of those moments in history where symbolism and social pressure braid together, and the braid becomes a noose. Now, let's sit with a single evening in the peak of this aesthetic. A grand event. Torches flicker. Music hums low. The women arrive, their gowns heavy, their faces pale. Some have slept sitting upright to protect elaborate hair. But even before we reach the hair towers, the corpse look demands its own posture. Shoulders slightly drawn in, movements slow, smiles small, eyes lowered then lifted, glassy with shadow. A woman named Isabella, or Anne, or Margaret, any name will do, because the role is larger than the person, steps into the hall. She has not eaten properly in days. Her stomach is quiet now, not from contentment, but from surrender. She feels a dizziness, when she turns her head. She steadies herself by touching the edge of a table. The touch is light, practiced, as if she is merely admiring a carving. A friend leans close and whispers a compliment. "You look heavenly. You look like you are not of this world." The woman smiles because she has succeeded. And then, as the night goes on, she feels the familiar warning. The edges of sound fade. The room tilts gently. A darkness rises like a curtain. She sinks to a chair or to the floor, and servants rush with smelling salts, with water, with prayers. When she wakes, someone says, softly, how beautiful it was, how delicate, how refined. She has been rewarded for nearly vanishing. Later, in her chamber, she sits in the quiet and tries to eat a little, a spoon of broth. It tastes like life. It also tastes like guilt. She stops after a few sips, afraid of ruining the line of her cheeks, afraid of being seen tomorrow as too alive. This is the trap, and it spreads beyond the individual. Marriage contracts, some records suggest, included expectations about appearance. Husbands negotiated the presentation of wives the way they negotiated fabrics and lands. Even if the details vary, the general truth is clear. A woman's body was not fully her own. It was a symbol the family displayed. Physicians wrote about the consequences: malnutrition, weak bones, organ strain. Yet some of the same physicians prescribed fasting because they lived inside the same culture. They treated the wounds and also sharpened the knife. I want to offer you something gentle here. A slow breath, because the story can feel heavy. Inhale slowly, as if the air is warm smoke from the fireplace. Hold it for a moment. Then let it go. Long and quiet. Good. Now, remember that the women we are watching were not foolish. They were human. They were navigating a system that could punish deviation. They were trying to survive socially, even if the survival demanded physical sacrifice. And as the corpse bride aesthetic begins to fade, it does not fade into health. It shifts sideways, as trends often do. The hunger for status remains, and it looks for a new place to perch. It finds the mouth, because if you can no longer make the body disappear in quite the same way, you can still make the smile tell a story of wealth, rarity, and indulgence. You can still make your face carry a signal that says, I consume what others cannot. In the next part, we will move into a banquet where sugar is more precious than gold, where sweetness becomes a slow rot, and where some people begin to darken their teeth on purpose, not from neglect, but from pride. Honestly, I have always found it strange how a culture can take the natural signs of weakness and polish them into something like jewelry. The grand feasts are memorable, sure, but the trend lived in quieter places, mornings that began in silence. A woman wakes before the bells, touches her cheek with the back of her fingers, and measures herself by bone instead of comfort. She opens a small wooden box where her powders rest in folded cloth. When the lid lifts, white dust rises and settles again, soft as flour, sharp as stone. She coughs once, discreet, and the sound disappears into the room. A servant holds a mirror of polished metal. The reflection is never perfectly clear, so she sees herself as an idea, pale, shadowed, almost holy. It makes the whole routine feel dreamlike. She trusts the recipe. She trusts the servant. She trusts the court. Numbers shrink. A measured sip, an ounce of blood, a smaller portion, and time expands. Hours at the dressing table, hours resting, because standing makes the world sway. In that hush, she listens to water somewhere in the castle, a fountain, or rain in a gutter, and the sound comforts her, even as she fears it could wash her mask away. So the trend fades slowly, not with a single awakening, but with tired hands loosening their grip. And while cheeks begin to fill again, the hunger for proof looks for a new surface. It finds the mouth. Now the hall smells different. Not only candle smoke and wine, but something syrupy, something sweet enough to feel almost unreal in a medieval room. Sugar, when it first arrived in European courts in quantity, was not a casual ingredient. It was a treasure. It came from distant places, carried through trade routes that were long and dangerous, wrapped in the kind of expense that makes an ordinary mouth feel suddenly like a display case. If you were standing beside me, you might hear a small laugh behind a fan. A woman covers her mouth, then lowers the fan slowly, deliberately, revealing teeth that are dark, not merely stained, but blackened, as if the sweetness she consumes has left a signature on bone. To our modern eyes, it looks like decay, like illness, like sorrow. To them, in certain moments and circles, it could look like proof that you had sugar, often enough for it to ruin you. It is a brutal logic, almost elegant in its cruelty. When most people barely taste sweetness in their lifetime, the ability to destroy your own teeth with sugar becomes the clearest advertisement of wealth. You are not simply eating, you are wasting. You are showing you can afford excess, even when the excess turns into pain. The story often crystallizes around a famous face, Queen Elizabeth I of England, later in the 1500s. Accounts from ambassadors and observers describe her darkened teeth, and while the exact causes include more than fashion, sugar consumption certainly played a role. In a court where the monarch's appearance set the tone, the look could ripple outward, not because everyone wanted toothache, but because everyone wanted to resemble the center of power. Still, it would be too simple to say it was only imitation. The trend, in its many variations, was already hungry in the air. Sugar teeth became a sign, and signs attract people. Imagine a feast. The table is heavy with meat, bread, fruits preserved in honey, sweets shaped into little sculptures. Servants move quietly. Music drifts. A woman lifts a sugared almond to her lips. She bites softly, careful, because her teeth are sensitive now. The sugar melts. The sweetness feels like a warm spell on the tongue. Then the ache follows later, in the night, like a quiet punishment. Yet the next day, she eats another sweet, not always because she wants it, sometimes because she must keep the look. There is another layer to this, darker, in a different way. When a beauty signal is tied to a substance, those who cannot afford the substance will sometimes try to fake the signal. If you cannot buy enough sugar to rot your teeth, you can paint the rot. That is when the small pots return. Lamp soot mixed with vinegar, iron filings, dark syrups. Recipes drift through manuscripts and gossip, and it is difficult to know how standardized they were. But the practice itself is plausible, because people have always found ways to mimic status. A woman sits at her dressing table. A servant opens a container that smells sharp. A brush, smaller than the one used for brows, touches a tooth. The woman's lips part slightly. She must stay still. The brush paints black along enamel. The pigment dries. The tooth looks dead. It is oddly intimate, this work inside the mouth. The servant's hand is close to the woman's breath. The woman's tongue must stay back. The room is quiet except for the faint scrape of bristles, the little click of a container closing, the soft exhale when it is done. And beneath that intimacy, Danger waits. Some mixtures were abrasive, some were toxic, some, if they contained metals, could irritate gums, poison the body slowly, or simply accelerate the decay they were meant to mimic. The mouth becomes a laboratory, and the body pays the price. But fashion rarely stops at paint. For some, the darkness of decay became so prized that they wanted the pattern to be real. They wanted cavities, missing edges, that unevenness that suggests long indulgence. So the tools change again. Files, picks, small instruments made of ivory handles, metal tips, archaeological finds from various periods show dental tools used for practical care. But it is not impossible that similar tools could be used for deliberate alteration in certain circles. Some accounts describe physicians or specialists filing healthy teeth to create cavities that could be darkened, crushing small areas, chipping edges. Whether every detail is true is less important than the shared truth the stories reveal. People were willing to invite pain if the pain proved they belonged. Picture a woman in a private chamber. She is seated, a cloth under her chin. The practitioner, perhaps a court physician, perhaps someone less official, holds her jaw gently. The tool touches a tooth. A faint scraping begins. Scrape, pause, scrape again. The sound is small, but it travels through bone. It is the kind of sound you feel more than hear. The woman grips the arms of the chair. Her toes curl inside her shoes. She tries to breathe through her nose. The air smells of wine and metal. A small hollow forms. The practitioner nods, satisfied. Into that hollow, a dark paste is pressed. Tar, soot, crushed pigment, whatever the recipe demands. The tooth now has a permanent shadow, a little doorway for infection to enter. This is where the story turns truly bleak, even if we keep the words gentle. Because mouths are not forgiving places. The gums swell, the nerves ache. A dull pain becomes a sharp one. Then it becomes a constant companion, sitting behind the eyes, humming through the skull. Some women wrote about sleepless nights. Some simply endured in silence. The court would not reward complaints. The court would reward the display. Smiling becomes a careful art. Etiquette manuals in later centuries certainly gave rules about how to show one's teeth, and even earlier social norms could shape the way people revealed themselves. If your teeth are your status symbol, you must show them, but not too much. A wide grin might be vulgar. A tight smile might hide the proof. So women learned a perfect opening of the lips, just enough to let candlelight catch the darkness. I find this detail haunting. The idea of practicing a smile, the way you practice a dance, not for joy, but for presentation. The mouth, which should be a place of warmth, becomes a stage for decay. The economic side of it is almost absurd. Sugar itself could cost fortunes. Darkening compounds, special tools, repeated treatments. Some households spent on this the way they spent on horses or jewelry. You can imagine the household accounts, the numbers written in careful ink, while the woman herself counts not money, but aches. One ache behind the left molar, one throbbing at the gum line, one sharp sting when cold air touches a chipped edge. And then there is eating. Rotten teeth make chewing painful, so the diet shifts. Soft foods, broths, wine, purees. The irony is thick. The trend is born from consuming sugar, but the consequence is that you can no longer eat properly. The body weakens. The face becomes thinner, not by choice now, but by necessity. In some households, servants might even help by preparing food in ways that require less chewing. Cut small, mash, soften. There are extreme stories of pre-chewed food, and while those may be exaggerated, the practical truth remains. Dental pain changes how you live. The mouth also changes how you speak. If your teeth are sore, you speak less. If your jaw aches, you avoid long conversations. Court life is full of words, but sometimes those words move around you while you sit in quiet, smiling carefully, letting other people perform the talk. And infection, the great quiet predator, lurks behind it all. Medieval physicians described dangerous mouth infections, swellings, fevers that could spread. They did not have antibiotics. They had poultices, prayers, extractions. They had courage and resignation. A tooth that rots can poison the body. A jaw that swells can make breathing hard. People died from this, slowly, often, in ways that did not look dramatic until the very end. Yet, for a time, the fashion persisted. Because status is a hard addiction to break, there is also the strange spiritual logic that sometimes wrapped itself around pain. Some religious writers praised suffering as a reminder of Christ's pain, and a person in constant toothache might interpret it as penance, as refinement, as closeness to the divine. Even if the church condemned vanity, the culture could find a way to sanctify suffering. So a woman sits in her chapel, lips closed, eyes lowered, feeling the slow throb in her jaw, and perhaps she tells herself it is noble, not only socially, but spiritually. The saddest part is that the trend could shame the healthy. Imagine a young noblewoman with naturally white teeth, strong and unbroken. She is not poor. She is not common. Yet in a circle where blackened teeth signal luxury, her clean smile becomes suspicious. She learns to hide it with a fan, with a veil, with a habit of not laughing too openly. She might even choose to darken her own teeth, not because she wants to, but because she cannot bear the whispers. The body becomes a passport again, and then, slowly, the fashion turns, as it always does. People begin to fear death more than they desire the signal, or trade changes, or new ideas about health begin to whisper through medicine, or the pain becomes too obvious to romanticize. Still, even as the black teeth trend fades, it leaves a lesson behind, a bitter taste like burnt sugar. The human hunger for symbols does not disappear. It simply finds a new surface. And in some places, that surface is the lips themselves, not the smile, but the color. A red so intense it looks like devotion. A red that burns, that stings, that feels alive even as it poisons. In the next part, we will lean close to a dressing table where a lipstick mixture steams faintly in a small dish, where the brush is silver, where the color is called holy, and where every careful application is a kiss offered to danger. If we slow down here, you can almost hear how the mouth becomes a stage. A woman stands by a window, daylight, thin and gray, pressing her tongue gently against a tooth that has been darkened. There is a rough edge where enamel is no longer smooth. It is a tiny thing, yet it fills her awareness. The mouth notices everything. She closes her lips and tastes metal even when nothing is there, as if the pigment has left a memory on her tongue. Each morning, the ritual repeats. A cloth is laid out like an altar linen. A cup of water, a small pot of blackening paste. The servant's hand moves carefully, because a slip could stain the gums and turn luxury into the look of illness. The woman lifts her chin, holds still, and practices her smile. After, lips part, darkness shows, lips close, again, like waves. At feasts, sweets are carried as if they are jewels. a marzipan fruit, a strip of candied peel, a cake shaped like a tower. The artistry is admired, but the deeper display is this: the ability to consume sweetness without flinching. She chews on one side, slowly, avoiding the tooth that throbs. She swallows. Someone notices her dark smile and offers praise that sounds gentle but feels like a measurement. You must be very fortunate. You must have the finest sugar. Later, in her chamber, the ache returns. Candle down to a stub, a cloth pressed to her cheek. She tries small comforts, wine rinses, a little clove if she can get it, honey on a sore gum, and the calm lasts only a minute. Then the pain hums again behind the eyes. She thinks of asking for help, then remembers that help might mean a tooth pulled with nothing to soften the moment. So she endures, and in enduring, she keeps the symbol alive. And when the fashion finally begins to turn, it does not dissolve into kindness. It simply slides elsewhere. Teeth give way to lips, and the next proof is not black, but red, a color so intense it looks like devotion, and sometimes burns like it too. There were even evenings when speaking became difficult, not from shyness, but from the simple fact that opening the mouth hurt. Words were saved, smiles were rationed. Some women learned to communicate with glances and small notes, letting paper carry what teeth could not bear. That quiet, the reduced voice, is part of why the next trend feels inevitable. If the mouth is already controlled, already treated like a surface to manage, then painting it becomes a natural step. A new jar on the dressing table, a new brush, a new story about purity and sacrifice. So let the sweetness fade on the tongue. Let the ache become distant, like a bell heard from far down a corridor. We are moving toward a color that promises life, while borrowing it just a little closer now. Close enough to see the faint steam rise from a red mixture and to hear the soft scrape of a spoon against a small ceramic dish. Now we come to the lips, not the teeth behind them, not the smile that flashes and vanishes, but the soft border of the mouth itself, that small, tender place where breath meets the world, where a whisper becomes sound, where a kiss could be comfort if it were not turned into a risk. If you were sitting beside me, you would see how the candlelight makes lips look different. In a dim room, any hint of color feels louder. A faint red can look like a wound, or like a rose, or like devotion. And in certain medieval courts, a deeper red was not only admired, it was demanded, wrapped in layers of symbolism until it felt almost inevitable. Some writers tied red lips to the blood of Christ. Some tied them to vitality, to fertility, to the idea that a woman should appear both fragile and glowing at once. It is debated how consciously people thought about those meanings from day to day. Often, a trend begins as fashion, then learns to speak the language of religion and virtue, because that language gives it power. Still, we can sense the atmosphere. A woman in a chapel, candles trembling, saints painted on the walls, and the mouths of those saints and queens stained a little darker than nature. So the jars appear on the dressing table, small containers, heavy lids, pigments, ground fine as dust. The servant opens one, and the smell rises first. Sharp, mineral, something that does not belong close to the body. The woman inhales and keeps her expression calm. She has practiced calm. Calm is a kind of armor. The mixture is prepared slowly. A spoon scrapes against ceramic. A little powder, a little oil, perhaps a plant extract, perhaps something far more dangerous. Some recipes in later sources mention mercury compounds, like cinnabar and lead oxides, and other substances that could make the color brighter, more lasting, more prestigious because they were rare and risky. We cannot be sure how widespread each ingredient was. Some scholars argue many women use safer pigments, berries, clays, crushed insects, while the most toxic formulas belong to smaller circles of wealth. But even when the exact recipe changes, the ritual remains. Imagine the application. The woman sits very still, as if she is posing for a portrait. The servant holds a small brush. The brush is dipped, lifted, and a bead of red glistens at its tip like a tiny drop of wine. The servant leans in. The woman parts her lips slightly. Breath is warm. The brush touches the lower lip first, a slow line, then another. The pigment spreads. Sometimes it stings, sometimes it burns. If the mixture is harsh, the lips swell slightly, and that swelling is interpreted as desirable, as if pain itself is the proof that the color is real. The woman blinks once, slowly. She does not pull away. She has learned that pulling away looks childish. A noble woman is supposed to endure. There is a soft sound as the brush lifts, then returns. The upper lip is traced. The cupid's bow is shaped. The color deepens. In candlelight, it looks almost black-red, the kind of shade that could be seen from across a hall, the kind of shade that turns a mouth into a signal. And then comes the part that always makes me pause. Lips do not stay still. They move. They drink. They speak. They lick themselves unconsciously when they feel dry. So whatever is on them becomes part of the body, not only outside, but inside. A woman might take a sip of wine and taste the pigment. She might press her lips together and feel grit. She might lick the corner of her mouth and swallow a trace of whatever the jar contained, day after day, a little more. It is gentle to say it like that, but it is the kind of gentleness history sometimes uses to hide its sharp edges. The truth is that repeated exposure to certain heavy metals can cause trembling, weakness, strange moods, confusion. Medieval physicians described ailments with poetic names: fevers of the mouth, madness of rouge, illnesses that were hard to classify. We cannot always match symptoms to causes with certainty, but we can listen to the pattern, the pursuit of color, the slow cost. There are also tools, not just brushes, but scrapers to remove yesterday's residue, powders to set the color, ointments to soothe the irritation, so the woman can do it again tomorrow. The dressing table becomes crowded, a cloth for wiping, a small dish for mixing, a little mirror, sometimes glassy, sometimes metal, reflecting the mouth imperfectly. The woman sees her lips as a blur of red and trusts the servant to make them perfect. Sometimes, in certain accounts, the pigment is not enough. The lips must look not only red, but alive in a particular way, a certain rawness, a certain shine. So the woman rubs her lips with abrasives first: salt, sugar, fine cloth, anything to roughen the surface so the color will catch. She does it slowly, because rushing makes it worse. The sensation is tender, like scraping the skin of a fruit. She breathes through her nose. She keeps her jaw loose. Then the red goes on. The sting is stronger now. The woman closes her eyes briefly, then opens them, looking into the mirror with a calm that feels practiced and fragile at the same time. There is a social side to this, too, as always. A woman without properly colored lips might be seen as careless, or poor, or morally lax, depending on the court and the era. The rules shift, but the pressure remains. A maid might whisper, The lady looks pale in the wrong way. A rival might smile softly, pleased. A husband might not care. But husbands are not the only audience. Sometimes they are not even the main audience. The real audience is the room full of women who know the recipes, who can smell the pigments, who can tell how much was spent. Imagine a morning before a major event. The castle is quiet, except for footsteps in corridors, the rustle of skirts, the distant sound of water being carried. The woman sits by the fire to keep her hands warm because cold hands tremble, and tremble ruins precision. She warms her fingers, then lifts them to her mouth, feeling the skin soften. She nods to the servant. The routine begins. There is something almost ritualistic about it, like prayer. And, like prayer, it can be both comfort and trap. Now, while lips are being painted, another odd rule appears in the story. Intimacy becomes dangerous. If the pigments contain harsh substances, a kiss could sting the other person's mouth. Some households, it is said, warned husbands not to kiss their wives immediately after application. Whether that warning was common or rare, it carries a symbolic truth. The pursuit of beauty can make closeness costly. A woman becomes, for a time, untouchable, beautiful, admired, set apart, lonely in a very quiet way. The mouth, once a place of warmth, becomes a place of discipline. And still, the red continues, because the red is visible. It performs well under torchlight. It photographs well in the slow memory of paintings. It makes a face look intentional, as if every part of the body has been arranged for a purpose. But even the brightest pigments cannot hold the whole story. The desire for spectacle keeps moving. It drifts upward to the hair. You can feel the transition in the way servants begin to carry larger objects, not just jars and brushes, but frames, wires, padding, combs that look like tools for building rather than grooming. A woman's hair is no longer simply hair. It becomes architecture. Before we step fully into that towering world, pause with me a moment. Let the candlelight soften. Let the jaw loosen. Let the tongue rest gently behind the teeth. Take a slow breath in and a slower breath out. Good. We will leave the red mouth behind for now, with its quiet burn and its dangerous shine. And we will follow the whisper of footsteps into a hall where doorways have been widened for hairstyles, where women move carefully because wind could topple them, and where the simple act of sleeping becomes a complicated engineering problem. The fire crackles, dust drifts in the warm air. Somewhere beyond the window, water runs in a gutter, steady as time. And in that steady sound, we begin to look up toward the impossible height of medieval hair towers. Picture the first time you see one. You enter a banquet hall, and your mind expects ordinary silhouettes, faces floating at a familiar height. Then, you notice that some women seem taller than they should be, not because they stand straighter, but because something rises above the skull, like a second body. A tower, shaped from hair and wire and patience. Candlelight catches pins and ribbons. The tower throws a soft shadow on the wall behind her. When she turns her head, the shadow turns too, delayed slightly, as if the structure moves on its own schedule. The work behind it begins long before music. A woman sits near a window where the light is kind. A basin of warm water steams faintly. A servant loosens yesterday's powder with a cloth, then combs slowly, careful not to snag. Hair is divided, twisted, braided, pinned. Not only her own hair, either. Extra strands are stitched in, bought and traded, so the tower can rise higher than nature ever intended. Then comes the frame, wire covered in fabric, padded with wool, secured with pins that bite. The woman feels each pin as a small pressure, Then a deeper pinch. Then the numb hush of the scalp, giving up its protest. She breathes. She keeps still. Calm becomes her craft. Wax is warmed. Oils are smoothed in. The smell is sweet and heavy, like honey, too close to flame. The tower gains weight. Her neck tightens without permission. She learns to move carefully, turning her whole body rather than snapping her head, stepping as if the floor is uneven, even when it is not. A servant hovers nearby, ready to steady the structure with a casual touch, and sleeping. Sleeping becomes a quiet engineering problem. Some women rested upright, supported by special chairs. Others slept with raised headboards, their necks angled so the tower would not crush. Imagine half dreaming while holding a building on your skull. The body learns a guarded drift, waking on small aches, then sinking again. There was always the fear of fire in torchlit halls, because wax and feathers do not love flame. There was the fear of wind, because a gust can tilt what took hours to build. Yet the towers persisted, because they were not only beauty, they were language. They said, I have servants, I have time, I have the right to be delicate. Fashion never sits still, though. It slides downward again, from the head to the torso. In paintings and wardrobe lists, you begin to notice a curious curve. Women appear rounded at the belly, as if life is always beginning there. Sometimes it was real pregnancy. Often it was not. Beneath gowns, padding appears, soft wool shaped into a dome, tied with ribbon, adjusted until the silhouette suggests a blessed abundance. Servants lift the padding, shift it, retie it. They step back, squint, then correct the curve again. The woman watches their faces in the mirror more than her own reflection, because their reactions tell her what the room will think. The padding changes her balance. It asks for a slower gait, hands resting lightly on the dome, as if protecting something precious. And then, in the next chamber of our story, the craving for symbols reaches the feet. Shoes will begin to lengthen into pointed promises, elegant and impractical. Little arrows aimed straight into discomfort. I like to linger on one small moment there, because it shows how gentle a cruelty can look when everyone agrees it is normal. The woman stands while the last layer of her dress settles over the padding. Fabric sighs into place. The servant smooths the front with flat palms, then taps lightly, listening for the sound of the stuffing shifting. The woman breathes in, feeling the pressure against her stomach. Not painful exactly, but present. A constant reminder that her body is being asked to play a role. She takes a slow step. The padding sways a fraction of an inch, then steadies. Another step. Her shoes whisper against stone. She practices a hand position. Fingers spread softly across the curve, a gesture meant to look instinctive, tender, natural. Outside the window, rain begins, or wind, or the distant drip of water from a gutter, and the sound blends with the rustle of her skirt until it feels like the whole castle is breathing. It is easy to see how the performance could slip into the self. Wear the curve long enough, and your posture changes. Your thoughts change. Your pace changes. Even your sense of space changes, because doorways feel narrower when you carry a symbol in front of you. And then, when the gown is finally complete, and the tower of hair is balanced, and the belly is properly blessed, the woman steps out into the corridor, where torchlight flickers and dust floats like slow snow. Her servants follow, quiet as shadows, down the stairs, across the hall, and toward the place where shoes wait, pointed and ready. In a quiet corner of the corridor, the shoes wait like strange animals at rest. They are elegant, in the way a needle is elegant. The leather is polished. The stitching is neat. The color might be deep, red, brown, or black, depending on the house. Yet the first thing you notice is the length. The toe stretches forward, far beyond where any human toes could ever reach. As if the shoe is trying to point toward a future the body is not meant to follow. Poulains, some called them, pointed shoes that became a kind of obsession in parts of medieval Europe. If you were standing here with me, you would hear the soft scrape of a servant lifting one shoe, then another. You would hear a small chain clink against metal as it is tested in the hand, because some of these shoes were secured, not just tied, as if the point itself needed to be managed like a leash. A noble woman sits on a bench. She lifts her skirt carefully so the fabric does not snag on the long toe. A servant kneels and slides the shoe onto her foot. Leather hugs the skin. The point extends, empty at first. Then the servant stuffs it with material to keep its shape. Maybe cloth, maybe moss, maybe something stiff. There are accounts of internal supports, crafted by specialized makers, because a long point collapses if it is left to itself. And then she stands, slowly. Her balance shifts forward. Her ankles compensate. The point is not heavy, but it is awkward, a lever that changes everything. She takes a step and feels the danger immediately. The toe could catch on a rug edge. It could bump a chair leg. It could jab the person beside her. So she learns a new gait, a careful shuffle, almost like walking on shallow water stones. Servants appear again, always the servants. One might walk a half pace ahead, watching the floor. Another might hover to steady her elbow. In some courts, it is said, the points were chained up to the legs so they would not drag, the chain tugging slightly with every step, reminding the wearer that beauty is being controlled. The room responds with admiration anyway. People do not say, "How can she walk?" They say, "How refined, how fashionable, how clearly she does not have to hurry." The body, though, remembers. Over time, toes can be squeezed and shaped by footwear. Bones adapt. Pain becomes background. Medieval physicians wrote of foot troubles, of deformity, of chronic soreness. Their language was not modern, but the sensation is familiar. A dull ache that lives in the joints, a tenderness that flares when the shoe is removed, a dependence that forms because the foot has been trained to fit the fashion. And now, let the image soften. Let the shoes fade into shadow. Let the mind exhale, because after feet, the story rises again, not to hair this time, but to the invisible world around the body, the air itself, perfume. It sounds gentle, doesn't it? A pleasant word. Yet in some medieval recipes, the pursuit of scent could be as harsh as the pursuit of color. Strong perfumes were not only about attraction, they were about wealth, about access to rare ingredients, about the belief that scent could protect against disease, bad luck, unwanted spirits. The same little bottle could be charm and status symbol at once. Imagine the morning ritual, a small room used like a laboratory, glass and ceramic vessels, herbs hanging to dry, a metal distillation device in the corner, the kind of thing an alchemist might use. A servant pours liquid into a dish. The smell rises quickly, sharp with alcohol, heavy with resin. Some recipes, according to later compilations, included substances we now recognize as dangerous, heavy metal salts, strong plant extracts, things that irritate skin and lungs. We cannot be sure how common the worst formulas were, Some scholars suggest milder blends were far more typical, but even mild blends could become oppressive when used without restraint. The woman lifts her arms, and a servant dabs perfume behind her ears, at the throat, at the wrists. Then, as if that is not enough, the servant touches the fabric too, saturating sleeves, bodice, the inner lining of the skirt, shoes even. The goal is not subtlety, the goal is presence. She steps into a hallway and leaves a trail. Another woman enters and immediately knows who passed. That is the power of scent. It is memory made physical. It is a signature that clings to stone, but the body pays attention in its own quiet way. Headaches, dizziness, nausea, a strange fog behind the eyes. Medieval texts describe maladies of scent, of the mind disturbed by strong odors. Whether they understood the chemistry or not, they understood the feeling. Too much fragrance can make the world tilt. Some people even tasted their perfumes, believing it would sweeten breath from within. It sounds unbelievable, yet humans are good at believing what they want to believe, especially when a practice is expensive and praised. The bottle becomes an authority. The ritual becomes proof. And always, always, the competition returns. Scent wars. Stronger, rarer, more exotic. Musk, civet, ambergris-like substances. Resins from far away. The heavier the smell, the louder the status. Now, let the candlelight in your mind dim a little more, because the next place fashion reaches is the eye. There is something intimate about the eye, something vulnerable. To touch it is to admit trust, yet some women, and certain places and times, did exactly that, deliberately placing drops into the eye to change the pupil. Belladonna, the beautiful woman, nightshade preparations that could dilate pupils, creating a wide, glossy gaze that was interpreted as seductive, dreamy, otherworldly. Some medical writers discussed it, some beauty manuals mentioned it. It is debated how widespread it truly was, but the idea itself tells us something. The hunger for a look that appears natural, even when it is forced. Picture the scene. A woman sits in a dim room because bright light hurts more after the drops. A servant holds a tiny vial. The vial is cool glass. The dropper is silver. The woman tilts her head back. Her throat stretches. Her breathing slows. One drop falls. It touches the eye like a cold bead. Then the sting arrives. A mild burn that spreads. The eye waters. She blinks, trying not to blink too much, because blinking pushes the liquid away. She holds still, eyes open, tears sliding down her cheeks, and she smiles faintly because she knows what the mirror will show later. The pupil darkens, widens. The world becomes softer and more painful at the edges. Light blooms, details blur. The woman becomes more dependent on candlelit evenings because daylight is too sharp. She becomes, in a sense, nocturnal, living in the same dimness we are sitting in now. And the risks remain quietly present. Repeated exposure to such substances can damage vision. It can cause headaches, confusion, even strange dreams. Some accounts speak of madness, hallucinations, moods swinging like a door in wind. Whether every story is accurate or embroidered, the pattern is clear. The price is paid in the nervous system, in the private softness of perception. Now, we move again, deeper into the body, the silhouette. If hair towers are architecture for the head, then body shaping is architecture for the ribs. Mechanical stays, whalebone, leather, metal supports, not the later Victorian corset exactly, but earlier devices and practices that sought the same result. A figure that looks controlled, refined, almost inhuman in its proportions. Imagine the morning dressing ritual. The room is warm because cold muscles resist. The woman stands with her arms slightly raised as the first layer is wrapped around her torso. The material is stiff. It smells faintly of leather and oil. Servants pull on laces. Another servant holds a pulley, or simply braces a foot against the frame for leverage. The lacing tightens. She exhales. The lacing tightens again. Her ribs yield a little. Her stomach is pressed. Breathing becomes a conscious act. The woman learns to take smaller breaths, high in the chest, because deep breaths are not allowed. She learns to eat less, not only because fashion prizes thinness in certain moments, but because a compressed abdomen does not welcome fullness. Some women began young. Their bodies were shaped over years, the way a tree can be trained by stakes. The body adapts, organs shift, muscles weaken, and then, in a cruel twist, the device becomes necessary because without it the body feels unstable, as if it might fall inward. It is easy to say, why would anyone do this? But remember the hall full of eyes. Remember the language of status. Remember that belonging can feel more urgent than comfort. Now, in some corners of the medieval imagination, the desire for permanent marks went even further. Scarification, controlled scarring, patterns burned or cut, and then tended so they heal visibly. Some accounts describe artisans who treated skin like parchment. We should hold uncertainty gently here, because the evidence is not as straightforward as with clothing and cosmetics. Yet the idea of deliberate scar cultivation appears in various contexts, and the broader truth is familiar. Humans have always been willing to turn pain into art, when art becomes a badge. Picture a small chamber, quiet except for the fire heating a tool. The tool glows faintly. A woman lies still, jaw clenched, hands open so nails do not dig into palms. A practitioner presses a pattern into the skin. There is a smell, sharp and unpleasant. The woman turns her face toward the wall and breathes through it. Later, she will care for the wound carefully, and sometimes, it is said, irritated so the scar rises more dramatically. The body is asked to remember. And then, after all of this, after paint and points and perfume and poison and pressure and scars, our story returns to a question that sits quietly at the center. Why? Why would powerful, intelligent people choose rituals that harm them? At first, it is tempting to answer with romance, to say they did it for men, for attention, for love. But the more you listen, the more the evidence whispers something else. Men's writings from the period, love poems, and letters often praised features that court fashion tried to erase. Warmth in the skin, signs of health, natural hair framing the face, bodies that looked capable of living rather than performing. Some husbands, it seems, tolerated the rituals because they were normal, not because they were personally enchanted by them. Some complained, some looked elsewhere. The details vary by time and place, but the pattern is strangely familiar. The practices were not always for men. They were for the room, for the hierarchy, for the invisible scorekeeping among women, where each painful ritual was a proof of belonging, wealth, discipline, and access. Beauty became currency. Suffering became an investment. The harsher the routine, the more it could signal, I am not like you. I am above the sun, above labor, above ordinary comfort. And when that becomes the rule, stopping feels like stepping off a cliff. Refusing can look like poverty, like rebellion, like shame. Honestly, I think that is the most haunting part. Not the poison itself, but the way a culture can make poison feel necessary. And if you let your thoughts drift forward to our own time, you can see the echo, the products, the procedures, the pressure to display status through the body, the quiet fear of being left out. The details change. The mechanism stays. Yet there is also a softer lesson hidden in the dark. Those medieval women were not foolish. They were human. They lived inside a system that rewarded visible sacrifice. When the system changed, the rituals changed too. Trade routes shifted. New ideals rose. Old ones faded. Not because everyone suddenly woke up enlightened, but because the stage itself was rebuilt. Tonight, sitting by this fire, we do not need to judge them. We can simply watch the pattern with gentle eyes and let it loosen its grip on us. We can let the candlelight tell us that a body is not a billboard, it is a home. So, take a slow breath in and a slower breath out. Feel your shoulders drop. Feel your jaw soften. Let your tongue rest. Let your hands become heavy, like warm stones. Outside the room, time continues, steady as water in a gutter, steady as a river that does not care about fashion. Dust settles, candles shorten, the world grows quiet, and in that quiet, you can imagine those women finally removing the pins, untying the chains, wiping away the red, letting their feet relax, letting their eyes close, letting the air become simple again. If your mind wants to keep walking, let it walk slowly, barefoot, across cool stone, away from the hall of mirrors, and into a place with no audience at all. Just you, just breath, just the soft pulse of the night. Good night.